I read for self-improvement, I read for entertainment, and I read professionally. As a writer, if I'm not reading, I can't do my job. Every year I get asked for my favorite books. That's because I read a lot. For more than 10 years, I've been doing this thing called the Reading List newsletter, where I recommend 4 or 5 books every month. This list now goes out to something like 300,000 people all over the world. I'm Ryan Holiday. I've been writing about Stoicism now for almost 15 years. I've spoken about it to everyone from the NFL to sitting US senators and special forces operators. This is my bookstore, The Painted Porch, which carries a selection of life-changing books that have been hugely impactful for me and my wife. We have a video about this bookstore if you want to check that out. But in today's episode, I wanted to go through the books that were most impactful for me this year. Some are titles that came out in 2021. Some are really, really old books. Some are books that I reread this year that I got a lot out of the second or the third time. So out of the hundreds of books that I read this year, that I read about this year, that I talked to people about, these are the ones that had the most impact on me. And that's why I'm recommending them to you. As always, I reread Marcus Aurelius' Meditations this year. The fact that Marcus Aurelius was writing during the Antonine Plague, that he may well have died of the Antonine Plague, I think created a different way for me to see and understand what Marcus was talking about. When he says you could leave life right now, let that determine what you do and say and think. He was talking about that in a time when you really could leave life right now. He was talking about a fractured Rome, a contentious Rome, when people were at each other's throats, when things looked uncertain, when an empire looked like it was in decline. And while this is the translation I love the most, I have it on my bedside table and I flip through it on a regular basis. There was a new translation of Marcus Aurelius that came out this year. This is an annotated edition by Robin Waterfield. While this one, I tend to prefer the sort of more lyrical, poetic interpretation. This one does a really good job. It's a good translation, but then he goes through and he explains each entry. He connects them together. He talks about what they mean, really connects each one to the virtue. So rereading Meditations once in the translation that I'm most familiar with, but then reading this annotated edition, it gave me a whole other understanding, not just of this edition, but Marcus in general. There's this idea from Heraclitus that we never step in the same river twice. And this is a reason to reread, to read multiple translations of books that were particularly influential to you, because it gives you a new way of thinking about an idea that you thought you understood. Maybe just a slightly different interpretation helps you. Seriously, you can see, so when I read, I take notes at the bottom, and I took I folded nearly every page of this. I think what's amazing about Marcus Aurelius is that as timely as he is in this moment, he also is, as always, incredibly timeless. And there's a reason this book has endured now for almost 20 centuries. I really like this translation. I did a 2-hour interview with Robin Waterfield that you can listen to on the Daily Stoic podcast, and we should have it up on YouTube here shortly. This was one of the absolute best books that I read this year. And we are going through a racial reckoning in America, globally. There's a lot of people that are trying to capitalize on this, people who want us to be divided, people who don't honestly understand their history on both ends of the spectrum. I really love this book. This is how the word is passed, a reckoning with the history of slavery across America. Basically, Clint Smith goes to some of the most controversial monuments, plantations, slave pens, markers or moments in American history. And he explores what they mean, how they came to exist, the lies we've told ourselves about them. My bookstore here in Bastrop, Texas is on this historic Main Street. This building that I'm in dates roughly to the post-war Reconstruction period. And right down the street, there's a Confederate statue. This is actually a town that voted against secession, but then in the early 1900s, they put up a monument to the Confederacy. And I actually went down and spoke in front of the Texas Historical Commission about some of the ideas in this book. I'll play a little bit of the clip. You can sort of get what I'm talking about. The community rallied around an injustice. In response to an injustice, we talked to our local representatives, felt like we were making progress, this was going to be removed. And then here we are a year later, and there hasn't been any progress. This is an amazing book. I also had Clint on the podcast seriously, read this book, put your political predispositions aside, put your fatigue with the issue aside, or your outrage about the issue aside. Either way, this book hit me very hard and has changed how I think about a lot of things, and I think it will for you. Dr. Edith Eger is a complete hero of mine. At 16 years old, she's sent to Auschwitz. And how does this not break a person? How do they survive, endure the unendurable? And how do they emerge from this not just not broken, but cheerful and happy and of service to other people? It's an incredible book. She becomes a psychologist. She becomes a student of the one and only Viktor Frankl. I got to interview her on the Daily Stoic podcast, and seriously, the joy and energy of this woman, I had trouble keeping up. Basically, her mother sort of tells her that she has this choice, and this is the last thing her mother says to her before she's sent to the gas chambers. That this very Stoic idea that we can find ourselves in these horrendous situations, but we choose how we respond to them. We choose who we're going to be inside of them. We choose what we're going to hold on to inside of them. And that's what the book is about. That's what her psychotherapy is about. That's, of course, what Viktor Frankl's psychotherapy is about. She quotes Viktor Frankl. He says, "Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any set of circumstances, to choose one's own way." That's really what the choice is. I loved this book. It's so good. You should read it. And then that connected me to, of course, Man's Search for Meaning. This is a copy my aunt gave me in June 2005. Ryan, this is one of your grandmother's favorite books. I find there's great value between the covers. I wanted to pass on a copy to you. So I've read this book many, many times. I love this book. And I wrote an article this year for The Economist about an idea in this book from Viktor Frankl, the idea of, while the Statue of Liberty is wonderful and beautiful and inspiring, there needs to be a corresponding statue on the West Coast, the Statue of Responsibility. So I reread this. Mind-blowingly, there was a new Viktor Frankl book this year. They discovered a collection of old lectures and essays that he'd written, and they gave it this incredible title that hit me so hard. It's Yes to Life in Spite of Everything. And really, I think that's what Dr. Eger did. I think that's what Viktor Frankl did. That's what Marcus Aurelius did in the depths of the Antonine Plague. We say yes, because to say no means to give up, to quit, means to fall apart before our time, to abandon those virtues before our time. So we say yes to life in spite of everything. It's not this rose-colored, delusional, naive view of the world. No, the world is hard. The world is unfair. Things can suck. And certainly 2021 illustrated that in so many ways. But we say yes, we say thank you, we make the best of it. We choose our response to those conditions. It's the last of human freedoms. This book, Indian Givers, is not the most politically correct title, I will grant you that. Many years ago, I loved Jack Weatherford's book, Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World. Highly recommend it. Carry it here in the bookstore. But this book is about all the ways that First Peoples, Native Americans, don't call them Indians anymore, which is why the title's not the best, but the people who are here first, what have we learned from them historically, and how has our civilization been shaped by their insights, by their ideas, by their innovations that most of us completely take for granted? I just seriously found this book utterly fascinating. It's very rare that I read a book and almost nothing in it had I heard before, did I know about, and that's what I felt was happening on page after page of this book. He opens with these mines in South America. He talks about their breakthroughs in agriculture, their breakthroughs in building, all these things that you didn't know about. For instance, Benjamin Franklin gets the idea of a confederation, of a joining of all of the different colonies from a confederation of Native American tribes in New England at that time. Literally, this country, not only was it literally stolen from the people who are here first, but the idea behind it, the innovation that we take credit for, also wasn't ours. And I think this goes to the idea in Clint Smith's book. Studying these things, understanding it, it's not about whipping yourself, but it is about understanding things, not being afraid of the truth, not being afraid of unpleasant history. And look, if history makes you feel good, you're probably not studying history. This was a biography of Martha Graham, who I had read about through Robert Greene. I have this rule, I really like old biographies. I tend to find that new biographies tend to be trendy, they tend to be politically correct, as we're talking about. This book is so old, somebody gave it to somebody else as a birthday present in 1994. It says, "Happy Birthday, Paul," March 1994. I think the book was published in 1992. So this book is almost as old as I am. But it was just amazing. I'm fascinated with anyone who's truly great at what they did, who had sustained success at what they did. But I think another part of this book, outside of the in-depth exploration of her inspiration, of her excellence, of her practicing, of her obsession with craft, there's a story I love in the book. Before modern dance was accepted in polite society, Martha worked in vaudeville. And she tells this story about this act before her. It was these birds, like these performing birds. And she would talk about as the birds would about to be going on stage, they could recognize the cues and they would freak out. They would get so excited for the opportunity to perform. And so when her students were lazy or entitled or took it for granted or didn't give their best, she would say, "Birds, damn it, birds," meaning that like the birds cared about it, were more committed as performers than these sort of spoiled, talented people. And I loved that story. Agnes DeMille, who knew Martha Graham very closely, seemed to be a more balanced performer herself, really talks about the cost of Martha Graham's greatness, which was really important and powerful. I'm not a huge boxing fan, but I read two books. Victory Over Myself. This is the autobiography of Floyd Patterson, one of the great boxers of the middle of the last century, the first heavyweight champion to lose the belt and then win it back again. But first off, I just love the title of this book, Victory Over Myself. To me, that's the essence of what Stoicism is, the victory over oneself. How do we conquer our demons, conquer our issues, conquer that weaker, lower self that doesn't want to give everything? How do we become great at what we do? I didn't know anything about Floyd Patterson, who's also a civil rights activist, and it sounds like a real stand-up human being who came from the worst of circumstances. I wish he was better known. He was totally mistreated by Muhammad Ali and a bunch of other boxers. But great book. I really loved this. And then that reminded me of one of my favorite boxing books, this book, The Harder They Fall by Bud Schulberg. Now, I've read this book at least 2 other times. I remember this book as being a deeply influential, life-changing book for me because it's the fictional memoir, basically, of a public relations man, a press agent, as they used to call him, who's sort of in this corrupt, broken world, and he's struggling to get out of it, but he likes the money, he likes the attention. He keeps telling himself he's gonna get out of it, he just needs like one more job. And that was my life. If you read my book, Trust Me, I'm Lying, you know about my marketing career before I began writing and focusing on philosophy. My memory of reading this book was that I'd read it, and then it changed my life. I quit my job shortly thereafter, and this is where I am now. But as I was reading it and rereading it, the last page really hit me hard. He says, "I was the only one who knew right from wrong and kept his goddamn mouth shut. The only one who knew the score, who knew what was going on and still kept his hands in his pocket. The worst, the worst. I knew the trouble with me, I thought. Enough brains to see it and not enough guts to stand up to it. Thousands, millions of us, corrupted, rootless, career-ridden, good hearts and yellow bellies, living out our lives for the easy buck, the soft berth, indulging ourselves in the illusion that we can deal in filth without becoming the thing we touch." And so I remembered reading that and thinking that's what changed me. And that quote, the idea that we can deal in filth and not become the thing we touch, I think I even quote it in Trust Me, I'm Lying. It hit me that hard. This year was the 10-year anniversary of me writing that book. And I quoted in there, and I told myself this story that's what changed me, motivated me to change. And then I went and I looked at the Amazon receipt for when I bought the book. And I didn't leave my job for almost 4 years after I read this book for the first time, which is a critical Stoic idea. It's not enough to know what's right. It's not enough to talk about what's right. Ultimately, you have to do what's right. And so this year I put out Courage is Calling, which is, I think, my best piece of writing, but it's about exactly what he's talking about at the end of the book. Courage isn't just running into a burning building or fighting it out on the battlefield. It's the courage to make that lifestyle change, to speak up about something that you know is right, to get involved, to do the hard thing, to do the unconventional thing, the dangerous thing, not to put it off, not to lie to yourself about it, not to say it's somebody else, but the idea that if not you, then who? If not now, then when? That's what Courage is Calling is about. That's what rereading this book, seeing where I fell short in that regard, and not being able to lie to myself about it anymore. I'm so glad I reread this book. I'm honestly so glad I read all these books this year. You can check all of them out at The Painted Porch, Amazon, your local independent bookstore. Read them on Audible. I don't care how you read the books. I just care that you read, that you put the time in to read. And if you want some advice on how to be a better reader, how to really dig in and get the most out of the books, how I would have read these books, the notes that I took, how I broke them down, and will remember them and use them in my own writing, then check out my video on how to remember everything that you read. And please do sign up for the Reading List newsletter. It's totally free. Awesome recommendations on books. And keep reading, everyone. And hopefully I'll talk to you exactly 1 year from today with another stack of awesome books that will change your life. Every day now for 5 years, I have written an email about Stoicism. It's been a wonderful experience sharing with all of you. And if you haven't signed up, I would love to have you join us. It's the largest community of Stoics, not just in the world right now, but I think ever before in history. You can sign up at dailystoic.com/daily email. It's totally free, no spam. You can unsubscribe whenever you want, but I'd love to have you join us, and I'd love for you to be on this journey with me.